Welcome to Unsilent with your hosts, Dave and Brian. This is not another current events podcast. We're digging deeper, diagnosing, and discussing what's really going on today, how we got here, and providing observations for future generations.
Welcome to Unsilent. We're Brian and Dave. We're hoping you'll let us know where you think we got it right and where we completely missed the point, which you can do by visiting us at unsilentpodcast.com. So let's get into it. What's on your mind today, Brian?
Well, one of the things we've been talking about is institutions and how institutions are crumbling and how institutions are driving things but also falling apart. And I thought it'd be interesting to explain to Kenny G the specific institutions it seems like are driving things more than others.
Yeah.
There seems like there's a handful. And for those of you who are not sure who Kenny G is a person who will be middle-aged, probably around the year 2090. Could be one of my grandkids, or great grandkids, who knows, depending on how the years land. But somebody born around the year 2040. So I guess it'd be more like a great grandkid for me. And will be an adult around the year 2090. When we say Kenny G, that's who we're talking about, is somebody who is living in that era. So getting back to our institutions that we're talking about today, it seems like there's a handful, and the list I have is, Eisenhower's military industrial complex, which
Right.
now we would also include intelligence, I guess, like CIA kind of stuff.
Yep.
Media, newspapers, social media kind of stuff. Hollywood and, movie production, television, that kind of stuff. Academia, higher education specifically, and Wall Street. And, we're talking like, BlackRock and their ESG stuff, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Does that feel like the list to you? Or, I mean, there's infinite number of people driving things. There's no question, but it feels like that's kind of the big ones. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of as a general sort of top level levers of society. Those are the pretty big ones. I think that is the vast majority, as a matter of fact.
So let's just take them one at a time real quick, and we can take as much or little time as you want on this stuff, Dave, but take us through, like, how would you explain to Kenny G what we mean when we say the military industrial complex or the intelligence complex or the combination of the two are driving things? Like, what do we mean by that?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think you have to recognize about foreign affairs and human nature, et cetera, that war has been a constant companion to the human race throughout all of history. There's never been a time, no matter how enlightened we think we are, that wars and aggression against one's neighbors to take what they've got or defend our honor or whatever it happens to be has not been with us. And so the military industrial complexes, as Eisenhower talked about it in particular, and as we've sort of seen it evolve, is the business of warfare and intelligence and foreign affairs and international strife, if you will. That's big business because some of the biggest companies in the world right now, some of the biggest companies in the world, like Lockheed Martin, is a massive company. They produce incredibly expensive products. And therefore, those that I think one of the things that Eisenhower was warning about was this idea that these companies want to sell their stuff, and therefore, which every company does, and therefore conditions which are conducive to selling implements of war, which cost millions, billions, tens of billions of dollars. I mean, an aircraft carrier I looked at the other day was like one of our current aircraft carriers was like 12 or 13 billion dollars for one product. I mean, it's a massive product. But just for one, $12 billion. Not too many people in the world can afford that, even the rich guys. So the military industrial complex idea is that, and of course, who buys those? It's countries that buy those. You and I don't buy weapons of war, regardless of what people in the gun control debate would talk about. That's another topic altogether. And therefore, there is this sort of what some people would call an unholy alliance between governments and major defense contractors and major players, because it drives, and the only place that you get that money is tax dollars. And so therefore there's an incentive, a financial incentive for lots of people to see conflict happen in the world. There is, in
Yeah.
addition to the legitimate players, the ones that are arming what we might call the legitimate players, the ones that are supplying, for instance, the United States military, but you can question that as well. There are arms contractors. Arms dealing is a very big business globally because there's lots of wars going on that need to
Right.
be supplied. And so major
And
dollars.
this feels like one of those things that I hope Kenny G's Generation Gamma, hence the name Kenny G,
Right.
is what we're calling it now. I hope this is one of the things, kind of like Big Pharma, that we figure out a new incentive structure for these industries that really benefit in massive amounts financially when outcomes that are not great for mankind are achieved.
Right. Right.
The more warheads you sell, the more money they make, the more their stock is worth, the more they have lobbyists who dictate how many wars are made.
Right. Right. I would
And
hope
with
that.
and with Big Pharma, the more ailments we have, the more medicines we need, the more medicines we sell, the more lobbyists we can afford to lobby government to buy more medicines, which leads to finding more ailments. Or some would say creating more ailments.
Creating more. Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Well,
whether it's just like through food, bad food intake, or, poor diet, whatever,
right.
whatever. I don't want to get sidetracked, but point is, I hope by Kenny G's generation, they've really figured out these handful of industries. The military stuff is one of them, where it seems like the incentive structure is exactly 180 degrees from what we would want.
I would hope so, but in where I sit here in 2023 and looking at the history of humanity, I kind of doubt it, honestly, because so
Yeah.
what do governments exist to do? Governments exist to protect the citizens, to give them some kind of safety and security. And so I mean, the first reason that two or three people got together is there's bad people over there. Brian, why don't you and I form a government and we'll protect ourselves from
Yeah.
these guys over here? So, the basic reason for governments existing in the first place is essentially military. So the question about whether we can come up with an incentive structure that doesn't do that, this gets a little bit sci-fi-ish, but it seems to me that the only thing that could really cause that to happen, knowing what human nature is perhaps conquering space. Perhaps
Right.
but that gets into some really speculative territory. So I
Yeah,
hope
for
Kenny
sure.
G's over that, but I kind of doubt it.
Curious, and I honestly don't know this. You're a history guy. You would know this kind of thing. Do other countries, communist countries, socialist countries, do they socialize their military armaments, or does Russia and Cuba and whatever, do they have private weapons manufacturers like we do? I don't know.
Well, I mean, most countries buy them from folks like us and France and
Okay.
major arms dealers. I mean, we're the big arms dealers of the world. So most countries buy them from us. France is a big arms industry, but if
Okay.
you look at those other ones, like the Russians, the Soviets, the Chinese, there are no longer Soviets, but the Russians now,
Yeah.
all of them had a huge amount of their budget or have currently a large amount of their budget dedicated to that, building those things. And
But
so yes.
is it a government owned entity that builds them, or is it a privately owned company that the government buys them from like we do?
Well, in places like Russia in the past, well, I mean, Russia right now, private and government are basically the same thing under one guy.
Okay. Yeah.
And in China, absolutely,
China.
it's the
Yeah.
Chinese Communist Party. But there are, if you go to westernized countries like France, you're going to have, I can't remember the name of the company, but most of the French ones, as an example of another large arms dealing country, are private industry that has
Understood.
one client, and that's the government.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So like China and Russia, they're socialized, meaning on
Right.
paper they say that they're a private company, but they're really owned by the government.
Right.
Or
Absolutely.
whatever. Okay.
Yep.
All right. So it's not like here. Well, and the reason I'm asking, I find it interesting that of all the things in my lifetime I've heard that should be socialized, I've never heard arms building to be one of those things. And it kind of is one of the things that I could make it a pretty good case that should be
Sure.
a thing that would be government, not privatized. Interesting that I've never ever had this thought before, and never heard somebody talk about the government taking over arms manufacturing, but that
Yeah.
kind of would make sense to me.
Well, it would be, and it would be logical, and it also sort of almost already is to a certain extent, because F-16s built by Lockheed are, they don't have a lot of people to sell that to. In the United States,
Yeah.
they have one client, it's the government. Or in the United States, I mean, so the military industrial complex in the United States, as an example, I think there's two reasons it's not government controlled. One of them is because it gives them more leeway to do stuff that would come under scrutiny if it's government controlled. So
Right.
therefore, again, the money mode, you always got to look at, follow the money, right? And
Yeah.
secondarily, it's sold to other countries. There's, a lot of our stuff is sold very widely. We just made a deal in this
Which
country
again
for,
goes back to me saying this would be like, if we had less of that, that might not be a terrible thing.
right. Assuming then you don't have somebody rushing in to fill the void. That's even worse than our own military industrial
Yeah,
complex.
that's true, I guess. All
So
right. I got you. All right. So the next one on, and again, if you have others, Dave, of course, chime in with them. But the next one on my list is the media. Media is interesting because in my lifetime, media up until, I don't know, 2015, around there, 2012, maybe 2008, maybe somewhere in that range, though. It was perceived that the media was by and large calling balls and strikes to the best of their ability.
right,
Yes, they're humans. Yes, they have human emotions. Yes, they have biases like we all do. But Walter Cronkite and Tom Brokaw were guys that would put that stuff aside to the best of their ability and call balls and strikes.
right,
Now, that is not the way it is. You either subscribe to a media source, or you subscribe to media sources that deliver the kind of news you want, is
right,
predominantly how I would describe it being done. And there's not much room for the middle guy.
right,
You're either on this team or that team, and there's and finding truth is a exercise now, where before it just felt like it was just laid upon us, like the newspaper
right,
was delivered and we just woke up and went to our stoop and then the truth was there. and
right.
and now it's not that way. Am I saying that right, you think?
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, so we've become hyper tribalistic, and as a result of becoming hyper tribalistic, those that deliver what we want deliver the product. I mean, it's just the same thing with the military industrial complex. You have people delivering what you want for to satisfy your needs for one of two things, either money or power, one of those two.
Yeah.
And so, in some media, there's certain media that is not very profitable, but they still serve a demographic because they believe that it reinforces their cultural power. So cultural power
Right.
and money are both things that people want. And as a result of that, you've got these different streams of media. And I would propose too that comes that shift, that change has really come from another one we're going to talk about, which is academia, because a lot of the
Right.
folks that have come out of the journalism schools came with certain biases that said that we need to reform society. We're not out, interviewing people and reporting, but we need to reform society to our higher standards. And
Yeah.
therefore media has changed, and other media as a result has
Yeah.
changed in response to it.
I agree that media has changed from an entity that, now again, there's exceptions to everything. I'm not saying every single person in media does this. So like whoever's listening who's gonna like say that's not how it is. Okay, I'm speaking in general terms here, right?
Right.
Before I think that media perceived itself as an entity whose job it was to report what is.
Right.
And now by and large, I would say media sees themselves as people who should determine what is,
Right.
by putting certain spins, certain slants, certain perspectives, omitting
Yeah.
others. Like again, we're not a topical news show, but you can't help. I hope that in the year 2090, this is still pointed out in journalism school as an absolute example of what not to do. And that is the New York Times posting and reporting on how Israel blew up a hospital,
Right.
which was, and again, when they first reported it, maybe they didn't know because whatever. But within a couple of days, everybody kind of knew.
Right.
And they still reported that Israel had blown up this hospital in Gaza, which is not how it happened. It was a Hamas
Right.
rocket that did it, misfired. They just left it up. And then
Yeah.
when they were outed, they said, "Oh, well, our source was bad." Well, their source was was Hamas,
Was
So
terrorists. Yeah.
point is, like, I cannot imagine that happening in 1982 with Dan Brokaw or Dan Rather. I
Right.
can't. That would be, he would have been fired.
Yeah, yeah, it's changed quite a bit because the values have changed. And we've talked about this. We've talked
Right.
about values in the past. The values have
Yeah.
changed. The values have been in media, even at the time of the founding, was there to shine a light and to hold powerful people accountable. But now media has really shifted in a lot of ways to hold powerful people we don't like accountable. And that
Right.
whole narrative of I really think to a lot of it, it's this whole narrative of a sort of a classist society where you've got oppressed and oppressors, and we
Yeah.
are, as media, we're going to hold those that we consider to be powerful oppressors accountable, even if the facts don't back that up.
Right. Yeah, and one of the things that, for me, going through this experience, where, I mean, if Tom Brokaw said a thing, I just believed it. Now, again,
Yeah,
you'd figure, okay, 8% of the time, 3% of the time, he's going to get it wrong because he's human, and
yeah,
he's people out gathering information. They get the wrong facts sometimes, but his batting average was perceived to be like really, really high.
right.
I don't have that confidence at all anymore.
Nobody
Even
does.
with news sources I like, I don't have that
Yeah,
confidence at all.
right.
So part of me goes, well, was Tom Brokaw full of shit the whole time too? or or maybe not entirely, but are we just more aware of this now because we become tribalistic, or has it changed? And I think it's both, but
Yeah.
probably, what do you think? I think it's changed more, as in the people doing the reporting have changed. I also think we're more aware of things because of technology and stuff like that. But do you think I have that right, or do you think it's like half? We're just more aware that Tom Brokaw was really had a story to tell that was not, that he had to find the facts to support that, versus he believed that he was just there to report the news.
No, I think I think both of those things have changed, and I think some of it is because media has lost the centralized power. We had, when I was growing up, it was ABC, CBS, and NBC, and you tuned into one of the, Huntley Brinkley or Tom Brokaw or whoever it happened to be,
Yeah.
and their goal was to be the nation's spokespeople. Their goal was to be viewed by everybody. I mean, they had personal motivations, just as we all do, but their motivation was to be seen as the unbiased arbiters of what's really happening, of shining truth, or shining light of truth wherever it happens to be, Republican or Democrat. Didn't really matter in those days so much, even if they did have their own biases. And we also didn't know their biases either. Whatever biases they did
Yeah.
have, we weren't really aware of those. And that suited what they wanted to be. Now, there's no hesitancy for somebody to know their biases. However, all their biases on whatever side are usually positioned to be right down the middle. They're not biases. This is the truth, and
Yeah.
they're not biases. And so therefore now it's really about the keepers of the truth in these individual little tribalistic, enclaves. And that's all that
Right.
we listen to. And we want to keep those people happy. And that's really that's the product that's being sold now.
Yeah. What I've found interesting to learn over the last, well, 10, 15 years, again, I guess, that back when the country was founded, it was like it is now. It was the Federalist was a paper that supported a big government, and then there was an opposing view by Thomas Jefferson or whoever it was. I don't know. It was
The
whoever
anti
the opposing people were. That, what was the name of the
the
paper? Do you know?
anti-federalists. So we had the Federalists and the anti-federalists, and they wrote back and
Yeah, yeah.
forth.
They wrote back. Yeah, they basically wrote articles every day, just like debating each other in print.
Right.
And they were very polarized. And what's fascinating for me is as a person who's grown up with the Tom Brokaws and the Walter Cronkites and Dan Rathers, who were presumably calling balls and strikes. That's a recent phenomenon. That is not the history of our country.
Right.
That's only been the case since about 1950 or so.
I would say the turning point here's where I think I mean, yes, it was gradual, but I would say the real turning point you could pin on the Nixon Kennedy debates
Yeah,
in the early, what was it, 1960, whenever it was like 1960 or 61,
something like that. Yeah,
when there was typically up to that time, presidential debates were listened to on the radio. This was the first televised debate. And that's when it became less about the word and more about the presentation of the feeling, because those that listened to Nixon in those debates on the radio thought that he won. Those that watched it on TV saw Nixon kind of sweating and getting a little bit of fidgety, and
yeah,
they thought Kennedy won. And so from that point onward, it became less about what the founders experienced was rhetoric back and forth. It was the anti-federalists made a point, the federalists made a point. They would use some flowery
yeah,
language, and there's always been this accusatory thing of, well, you're just a buffoon for thinking this, Thomas Jefferson, and well, oh,
right,
Alexander Hamilton. What do you? So there was always that.
yeah,
But it really became more of an emotional thing when TV started, and that became a hyper emotional thing when most people started getting their news from social media. And at that point,
right,
it became about eyeballs and
yeah,
clicks, because that's
clicks,
where you
yeah,
get money and that's where you get
yeah.
power, is eyeballs and clicks.
So the mechanics of how the journalism industry worked changed from a
Changed.
subscription based, where you had 3 newspapers in every town, and they had a third, or whatever it was, but everybody got a newspaper, and everybody read the same news, to a clickbait model
Yep.
where whoever had the most outlandish headline that got the most clicks, they would make the money, and their competitors would not. And so the outlandish clicks coupled with the new journalist who feels like they have their purpose is to drive society in a direction rather than reporting on
Right.
the direction society is going. And other things, just the model has shifted. And well,
So,
the third thing being people who report some things more fervently than others, I guess I'll say,
right.
depending on whether or not it fits the story they want to tell.
Well, and a lot of it too, I would tie to another social phenomenon, and that is, I would say that the reporters and the presenters have become the preachers. So,
Yeah,
we've had a general decrease in the perception of society of religion being a source of ultimate principle and ultimate truth. That's been
right,
the majority of the time the country has existed. That was the case. That has decreased steadily over time. And so therefore we needed new preachers. We needed new prophets. We needed new
yeah,
people, gurus and sages to sit on a hill. Well, who are those to be? Those have become the most popular, best looking, most well-spoken people on TV and on social media and on videos. They have taken the place of the preachers of the past. They are the current preachers and prophets of today.
right. No, that makes total sense. So when we talk about the values changing, that's a pretty common theme for that. I think the values changing is what you and I are witnessing, and
Yes.
the struggles, in my opinion, come down entirely to different sets of values. So the values have
Yes.
changed in media or journalism. Is um, People used to think that their job was to report on what happened. Now they feel like their job is to drive a narrative and drive outcomes and drive beliefs and drive values, and we should value this thing now that we didn't used to value, and we should value this thing less that we used to value a lot. The preachers that
Yes.
you're talking about, that's
Yeah.
a shift in how they see themselves. It's even a shift in how the consumer sees them.
Yes.
There's people on prime time news, cable news channels now that are looked to. People can't wait to get their opinions, because then they will get their opinion after
Right.
that.
Yep.
And that is different. That the values of that role are different now, where it used to be they called balls and strikes. Now they determine the game to be played.
Yeah, and again, it's really back to that model of, where do you get your morality from? Where do you get your worldview
Yeah.
from? If I read a study, I don't remember exactly which one it was, but there was a study that talked up to kids coming out of people coming out of journalism school. And why did you go to journalism school? What do you want to accomplish? I want to change the world. Journalists
Right.
didn't used to change the world. They tell you
No.
how the world is, but now they want to
Yeah.
change the world. That used to be the thing that people coming out of seminaries and out of religious training, they wanted to change the world. And so now,
Yeah.
therefore, whether it's and this sort of goes to the other side of media, like the late night comic, who's going to make jokes and kind of tell you how you need to think through humor, whether it's
Right.
it's the humorists, it's the quote unquote reporters choosing what to report and what not to report, choosing that this story is not worthy of our goal, which is to change the world in a certain way.
Right.
And it's also come to a point where the consumer is less the driver and more the recipient of the change that needs to happen. We need to change. That's
Yeah.
what they think their goal, what their objective is.
Yeah, I think you brought up Nixon. I think that one of the easiest ways to illustrate what we're talking about is the difference in reporting Watergate, which
Yeah.
arguably, up to that point, maybe the biggest scandal in the White House. But I would also say there's probably big scandals that we just didn't have the technology to stay up on.
Right.
Again, Warren Harding was known as having a very corrupt cabinet and a very corrupt staff, but the technology was not such that, or whatever. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how the person voted in the newsroom when Watergate happened. They reported because it was a big story,
Right.
and it was corruption, and it was wrong.
Right.
And now, fast forward to 2023, at this very moment, we have a president who's accused of some pretty bad things, as far as like literally selling stuff to other governments that don't like us very much.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying he did or didn't do it. That is not relevant to this point.
Right.
What is relevant is the people who are in his camp have zero interest in reporting on this. The people who are not in his camp have a lot of interest in reporting that. Right. That is a great illustration, I think, of the difference you and I are talking about. Again, going back to, I can't imagine Tom Brokaw not wanting to cover the story because he didn't like how it would look if his guy in the White House got outed. That's a change in values.
Yes.
They want the narrative, they want the story, they want their team to win more than they want to hold powerful people accountable. And that was always the purpose of the media when I grew up was, we're here to hold powerful people accountable and report what's happening. Yes, we're going to talk about the elk that crossed the road, and that's, whatever. And it looked like a Christmas story or whatever because it was snowy. They report mundane stuff like that.
Right.
But deep down, though, they were there to hold big entities accountable so that little people weren't hurt. And now it's okay that people get hurt as long as it's their guy doing the hurting.
Well, it is also a change in the consumer because we're not interested necessarily in both sides of the story. I mean, most of the media that's propagated, I try to listen to a variety of, ideologies. I mean, I spend more time on my own ideology, but I listen to a variety of ideologies because I want to get the other side of the story. As Paul Harvey said, the rest of the story. I want to get an opposing viewpoint. I mean, what you and I say here in our podcast is tell us where we got it wrong, because we want to hear opposing viewpoints to know whether or not we're just following along a tribal narrative or whether this is actually objective fact. So, but the part of the problem today is, especially on the extremes of all the different ideologies, there is absolutely no interest in even knowing what the objective fact is or what the opposing facts are, because we just want to be part of this group that thinks in a certain monocultural way. And this is not just one side or the other. This is across the board. And so there's been a change, yes, in those that are delivering the news and those that are speaking to us what they think our morality should be in the media. And there's also a change in us that we want to be part of a tribe and we want that tribe to succeed. And therefore we won't consider news that doesn't back up what we think. So it's both ways, really. It's both ways.
Yeah. And final point, we got to move on. But final point that just occurred to me, the reason that's happened, or part of the reason that's happening, is because over time, the media has done a great job of convincing us that the other tribe is evil. The other tribe means the end of our democracy, which is a phrase I just want to throw up every time I hear. And both sides do this.
Sure.
That the other team, if they get their way, it's the end of our civilization as we know it. and therefore our tribe must win, which condone then green lights everything that the media does after that. All those things
Exactly.
we just spent 10 minutes talking about.
Yep.
All right, so moving on to a similar one, a little bit different though, Hollywood. How would you explain to Kenny G what the difference in Hollywood? I mean, again, off the top of my head, watch an Audie Murphy movie from 1948 and watch a war movie or something like that, now, just unbelievably different.
Right. Well, there's an old phrase that is now used in two different ways. Art imitates life, and life has now become something that imitates art. So there's this ideal, and I think some of it, a lot of it, stems from, as we become a more visual society, as we just talked about, as we become a more stimulated society, we look for expressions of that in our entertainment that fit our need to be stimulated in certain ways. So, if you take a look at my ancient dad, who's 95 years old, watches stuff from the 1980s, and the problems that they have to solve in the 1980s are pretty simple problems. The problems that they had to solve.
Awesome, man.
Oh yeah,
easy problems to solve.
Exactly. The problems that they had to solve when TV first came around in the 1950s and movies were usually pretty simple problems to solve. You've got an hour to figure out why, Marcia got a bad grade in school, or whatever it happens to be on the Brady Bunch. Now, however, we've got this sort of utopian ideal where we create entertainment that presents that ideal, and which is an unrealistic ideal in regardless. I mean, whatever it happens to be, it's an unrealistic ideal. And so it's gone from art imitating life, which is a lot of what you found in the early expressions of that, to now life wanting to imitate art. We've got people that want to dress like gangsters, that whether it's their clothes they wear, or whether it's I don't know if you and I were talking about this or somebody else, but the idea of everybody says, well, you're the OG podcaster. Well, what's OG means? It's original gangster.
Yeah.
So you're really aspiring to be a gangster. Is that really what you're telling me? So it's become this sort of caricature of life instead of actually life itself. And it drives then unhealthy, a lot of our movies, et cetera, drive unhealthy trends into society as a result of that. And they're unhealthy because they're not realistic. So that's a significant difference.
Yeah. I again, movies, in Hollywood and stuff, just watching Audie Murphy is just the example comes to mind, because he's literally a World War II hero. I think the most decorated World War II hero of all, I think, if I get that correctly. Came back home, went to Hollywood. He's a good looking guy, had the society had every reason for him to be successful. And he was in, I don't know, dozens of movies, whether it's Cowboys and Indians movies or World War II movies, where he was always the hero. Got it. Okay. But it would have been unthinkable to do a movie in 1949, 1952, where the Indians won.
Right.
That would have been unthinkable. And then like when I was growing up, you had the like Dances with Wolves, and like it was calling out things that rightfully were not as quaint and as neat as we liked it in 1949 and 1951. And now it's gone full pendulum the other direction, where you could not make a movie now like Audie Murphy starred in 1950. It would not get made, because straight white dudes, and frankly, America cannot be seen as the hero to that extent anymore, because you have to point out a certain number of flaws. Otherwise, it's just not going to get made. The movie just will not get made.
Well, and to a great extent, we find in entertainment, there is no real true hero. We have, so you think about the old John Wayne movies. There was the bad guys wore the black hats, and the white guys didn't wear. So you've got and you could tell because the black hat guys had the little handlebar, so you had very clear
Mortimer Frothingham, the black hat and the curly mustache, and then the guy in the white hat had the cool name like Chet or something like that.
Right, exactly. Well, and in all of those, they reinforced values that the society held that were like honor and
Yeah. Duty.
straightforwardness and duty. Right. So like one of the old shows from even before when I was a young kid was The Rifleman, and in that show there was a moralistic component to that show. Well, there's
Yeah.
still moralistic components to things now, but the moralistic components now to a lot of the media, a lot of the entertainment media, is that there is no absolute morality. There is no truly right and wrong. So we have to see how complicated the villain is and to see why this villain became this evil person. So we have the backstory, and there's a certain amount of reality in that, of course. But the point of movies was always, or the point of entertainment was often to call us to inspire us, to call us to something better, to call us to something higher or more noble. Not always, back to Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Shakespeare did plenty of things, Shakespearean tragedies, etc. But now it's really to call us to ambiguity and to what society has shifted to in terms of its moral compass, which is not very
Yeah, it feels
understandable.
like everyone has to find the nuanced, clever thing. It can't just be good guys and bad guys. That's
Right.
not. And listen, I'm not saying that I agree that things are as cut and dry as the movies in
Right. Of course
1951
not.
made them. Of course
Right.
they're not. They were almost cartoonish in how simple they
Right.
were. I'm just illustrating the dramatic change. Like it's 180 degrees. Movies that we make now could not be made then because you couldn't portray us as a nation, as a people, as a society, as being that bad. I don't know what else. There's a ton of adjectives I use there. And now you could not make one where we're that good.
Right.
That's a very, very big shift. All right,
Yes.
moving on. Academia, there's no question.
Yeah.
This one is now, to be clear, I'm a guy who's never gone to college. I mean, I've been on a college campus as a visitor. That's it. I've never been 1 hour in a college campus as a student, not 1 hour. So easy for me to poke fun at this. But so you have a lot more experience with this than I do. But kind of along the same lines, academia feels like its purpose now is to root out all the things that we thought were good and expose them as being bad. And I mean, when I say all, I'm not generalizing. I mean all. I'm literally saying like all the things that we thought were good. Their job is to expose that all of those things are not good. And I'm sure there's some exceptions. I can't think of one off the top of my head. I'm sure there are some. But overwhelmingly their purpose is to root out all and teach us that the things we thought were good were really bad. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, and I think when we talk about higher education in particular, we've got to kind of do a little bit of segmentation, because there's part of higher education. There's like the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and math. There are technical disciplines that exist still to do the technical things, but the people that govern the social, the societal part of the college campus these days are the people that in the 1960s we would have called the radicals, the people that want to completely upend the way that society actually works. In fact, this is really where a lot of the other things that we're talking about have their genesis in the
fourth turning and all that stuff.
Yes, exactly. It's the folks that in the college atmosphere have been trained that society should be a certain way that it is not, and therefore it's their job to, wherever they go, whether it's into finance or into sociology or into whatever, to change society and make it better. So as opposed to being just trained to a great extent, colleges in the past were mostly about getting a better job, getting a good career going. And there still is a fair amount of that in the technical disciplines, but in the non-technical disciplines and the overriding kind of umbrella to all of the disciplines is this idea that there is this higher knowledge, higher learning. There's a principle also called the Dunning-Kruger principle, which is this idea of if you know something in one area, you're automatically brilliant in all areas. That's sort of reinforced in the college atmosphere, so that that you can churn out a bunch of activists that are going to change change societal structure and make it more fair, more just, more righteous, essentially, according to the new
Right.
righteousness. And a lot of that, I would propose, comes from the efforts of those that want to recast society in this kind of oppressor oppressed kind of
Yeah.
dichotomy, that there's these two things, and if you're either in this category, and we're going to oppose the oppressors. And that's what
Yeah.
we find at college
I
campuses.
I I always think of I think it was Galileo. It might have been Copernicus. I think it was Galileo who they thought was should be locked up because he thought the Earth wouldn't run the sun. That was
Yeah.
Galileo, right? Okay, yeah.
Well, Copernicus, yeah.
So I always think about Galileo in this stuff because the there was no doubt people in late 40s, like again we're talking about that era, that Audie Murphy era. There was no doubt people in that era who were staunch in their beliefs and they were absolutely wrong about things. There's
Yeah,
no question
of
about
course.
that. And along come these radicals in the 50s and 60s and 70s and whatever and expose that stuff and embarrass them in cases where they flat out had it wrong. And there's no question that happened on some things. No,
Right.
I believe that 100%,
Sure.
just like Galileo did to the
Sure.
establishment back in 17 or 13 or whatever year he was alive. But the thing that they miss, I think, is they become the establishment.
Yes.
The radicals have now become the establishment, and they will be outed as the people who are so staunch in their beliefs and absolutely have things wrong because they take things too far in their
Right.
direction,
Right.
and they lose objectivity, and they get focused on the ideal outcomes and the ideal perceptions, and again they get focused on the positions they want to establish, not what is.
Right.
And that leads people down the wrong path every time, whether it's Galileo and his establishment, whether it's the people in 1968 outing the establishment that was formed in 1940, 1950, or it'll be this era outing academia that has their ideas wrong. It's the same, but these all throughout history, whoever comes to have the power or influence or whatever you want to call it, is generally be categorized those two ways, I guess.
Yes.
Once that is established, they want to change everything up to lead to this moment, and then they want to freeze in this moment in time, and they won't allow no deviation. And it doesn't matter. This is not a left or right thing. This is a human thing. And this is the part that I think that people miss today is it'll be the same for these people who rooted out silly ideas before, and I'm glad they did.
Yep.
These people have their silly ideas rooted out too because they've gone too far on some things.
Well, yeah, you're right. And it's when there's a taste of power too, then you tend to want to solidify your power, and you tend not to consider anything that could challenge that as legitimate. And so that's where we have come to, again, where you've got the prophets and the priests don't come from the churches and the synagogues and the mosques or whatever. They come from the halls of academia. And therefore, if you are questioning the truth that's being promulgated from the halls of academia, you are no less a heretic than somebody that questioned the Catholic Church in the 1300s or something like that. So you've got an entire and so there needs to be a reformation, just like the most major religions have gone through reformations where they said, this stuff that we think on this particular thing, we don't think that's really where we should have been. And so we're going to kind of, yesterday just to be hyper local, yesterday was Reformation Day. Martin Luther, back in 15 something or other, nailed his 95 thesis to the doors of the Wittenberg Church. Well, so academia needs a reformation where it really understands its role in ferreting out and elucidating reality, telling us about reality, allowing for multiple disciplines to discourse and to disagree with one another, because you really can't find truth unless you have disagreement. There's no finding of truth unless you have disagreement. I mean, and this is what then, this is how we can see that academia has become more of a sort of a church setting than it has been a place to investigate and discover new things.
Yeah. And again, my perception as a guy who's never been to college was that like people who went to MIT and Oxford and Harvard went there to be, and they came out very smart, capable people because they were challenged and they had to go through the mental exercises of proving their thesis on things. And like, And now, all by and large, that stuff is removed, and we create systems where they're not allowed to be
Right.
challenged, and they must be protected, and they must be kept quote unquote safe, is like one of the new 4-letter words. It's like, on the altar of the new
Right.
religion is keeping people safe, which is the opposite of what Harvard was. Or MIT or whatever was in 1978. I'm guessing. I
Yeah.
don't know. I wasn't there, but you had to work really hard to prove these things. You couldn't just say them and they just be so because your professor liked that ideology.
Right. And that's where this idea of safety is safe from competing ideas. See,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
the problem that we've got a system that protects people in the university settings to a great extent from competing ideas. Now, the university should be all about competing ideas
Right.
because you cannot
Right.
establish truth, again, as I just said, without disagreement. So
Yeah.
the safety is
Yeah.
actually stifling intellectual pursuit. It's actually stifling any kind of advancement or really stifling learning. That's, again, challenge us. That's how I learned, to get challenged.
Yeah. It's funny listening to people who have been to medical school talk about how the doctors treated the people in medical school. They had no time for their crap. They had no time for their opinions.
Yeah.
You shut up and do what you're told. It was just vastly different. And we talk about changing values. The values that have changed it used to be you would roll in there at high school after your cushy life, living at home with mom and dad and playing, golf and the team schools golf team, whatever, and with the easy life. And you walk in the door and your life was changed dramatically. And like you were confronted with things,
Right.
and you left there a capable, sharp person with great abilities. And
Right.
that my perception is that's going away because of safe spaces and all that kind of stuff, which is again how we'll end up with these narratives that will be exposed in a few years for being completely ludicrous because they're not founded
Right.
in any kind of truth anymore. All right, we're running late on time. Last one, speaking of power and influence, the granddaddy of them all, Wall Street. So Dave, talk to Kenny G. What is the change in values like on Wall Street now compared to before?
Well, certainly. I mean, there's an old phrase from the Bible: the love of money, or money tends to corrupt. The love of money tends to corrupt, right? So, it can be the root of many evils. And so, the what's happened on Wall Street again is a recognition of not just money but control. So,
Yeah.
so essentially, what we've got now is we've got power brokers with so much money that they can work together with government in a lot of these major corporations, where they can essentially get government to write rules that support the Wall Street company at the same time that the government then protects them from competition. So that's one of the major problems we have with Wall Street today. The second one is that the people have come out of these college sort of indoctrination pieces. Now, again, it's not everybody, but there's a significant amount have come out with a certain societal viewpoint that says that no longer is the pursuit of profit the most important thing, but the pursuit of societal change is even more important than the pursuit of profit. Well, you can only do that for a certain period of time and not have people who are investing your money come back and say, kind of like that profit thing too. So,
well,
the
the thing that's funny about that though is the companies that fold because they're not profitable, by and large, have people who got really, really rich along the way.
Yeah.
And we're not shareholders when the company folded, but we're shareholders at the peak.
Right. Yes, exactly. And so there's a
They talk
system
about how
of,
profit's not a thing, but somehow the individuals seem to still profit pretty handsomely.
well, and there's a system of perverse incentives in a pseudo-capitalist society. I mean, we're people say, well, this is a problem with capitalism. No, this is a problem with pseudo-capitalism, with crony capitalism, where you can, and it is a problem when you've got so much money that you can protect yourself from any competitive pressures, and you essentially have monopolistic power. That does become a problem, and it becomes a perverse sense of capitalism, not real capitalism.
Yeah, I would. It would not shock me if I were resurrected from the dead in the year 2094 and had a conversation with Kenny G, and he laughs about how quaint it is that governments used to be the most powerful entities on the
Yeah.
planet. Because by then businesses may be like the idea of a company being more powerful than the Roman Empire is like
Right.
ludicrous. A company being more powerful than the British Empire is laughable. Even as far as like not in the Germany, like when it was a
Yeah.
powerhouse, like a company being more powerful, that laughable. There are companies now that are more powerful than dozens of
Yes,
countries.
absolutely. Yeah, there's lots of them. I mean, and there's lots of them that have such global reach. There's this, when you've got such global reach that you can control what entire blocks of people, millions or maybe billions of people can do,
Yeah,
then you essentially have the power of government, and you're outside of the bounds of
yeah.
regulation.
Which I think, as we come into the fourth turning, and I've talked about this before, but one of the things I think will happen is we're going to have to
Yeah,
address that, and either because the rules have been written to keep governments at bay, they have not
yeah.
been written to keep companies at bay. And companies, as their reach and their influence and their power grows ever more strong every year, at some point we're going to either like be owned by
Right.
them or whatever. And I don't mean like literally owned, but like owned by them. Like we can only do certain things and we can only think certain ways. We can only buy certain products, or we're going to have to address this because the rules were just not written for this kind of environment. Like where the companies have this amount of power and
Well, and a
influence.
lot of that, I think it is that sort of unholy alliance between major companies and the rule makers in government. And so you've got,
Yeah.
we talked about this in one episode where we talked about how everybody at some point during their day is breaking some law because there's so many laws on the books.
Yep.
Well, if you write if you write the rules and you can write the rules such that you have to have a team of 100 lawyers to be able to be compliant with that, you can effectively shut everybody else out of the market because only the super rich, super big
Right.
companies can't afford to do that. So essentially, what will probably eventually have to happen, I would think, if it does, is a flattening of all of that, a flattening of what it means to be a company, a flattening of what it means to be the government. So there's not so much of this insane, you've got investments happening through derivatives of derivatives of derivatives of derivatives. So
Right.
which is, what a
Right.
lot of that had effects on what happened in our own financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So there's got to be a flattening back to basic governance and basic commerce and basic kind of capitalism, real
Yeah.
capitalism, real government, where
Yeah.
there is no longer this unholy relationship between the two, and where governments don't have so much money that they can essentially control everything and control everybody. And it then is a perverse incentive for companies to control the governments. So it's become too complex. It's a monster leviathan. And unless that's all flattened out and become much more simple so that people can compete on the basis of good ideas and people are not competing on the basis of who has the best lobbyists, then,
Right.
then we might have a chance.
Right. Yeah. And hopefully we get back to a place where the benefit to the consumer is a significant part of the equation again. Not
Yes, yes,
how we
exactly.
can steer the consumer, but how we actually benefit the consumer based on what the consumer wants.
Right.
I hope we
Exactly.
get back to that. One of the things that stands out to me out of all these five is none of them have to deal personally with the consequences of bad policy.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Regular folks like me and you do. But these top five, and again, for those of you listening, this is where we say if we got it wrong, tell us. This is exactly what we're talking about. If you think the top five we mentioned is omitting a major industry or uh,
Right.
what's the word I'm looking for? Institution that's driving
Yeah.
things. Tell us. I would love to hear what you think that we missed, and if you think we're explaining
Yeah.
how one of these things is incorrectly, this is exactly what we're talking about when we say tell us where we got it wrong. This is where we mean it. If you think we're
Right.
describing how Wall Street is behaving in a way that is wrong, tell us. I would love to hear your opinion on that.
Right.
Anyhow, these seemingly top five, they're certainly top five out of the top 10, I would say guaranteed for sure.
Right. Yeah.
None of them have to deal personally with the consequence of getting these things wrong. None of them have to deal with policies that are harmful to regular folks. None of them have those
Yeah.
worries. They're all but immune from that because they have such
Yeah.
vast amounts of wealth or geographic boundaries or other boundaries where they're not affected by this stuff, the bad outcomes. I find that really
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, and that's when it becomes so complex and so multi-layered that you can find either you've got a scapegoat 34 layers down from you that will take the fall for you, and
Yeah.
you can just point to them and then say, well, it's their problem, or whether you've got a government system set up in such a way that there's no legal responsibility. You can do all sorts of things with no legal responsibility. Oh, we're getting sued. Okay, well, no, you're not getting sued. The taxpayers are getting sued because you're bad decision making, but you have no liability for that.
Right.
Or you've got so much, so much in terms of legal representation that nobody can ultimately touch you because they'll be tied up in court for 150 years. Of course, there are cracks in that now. There are some cracks in that, and we see some of that. But that kind of in incentive structure to isolate the most powerful from accountability is really a big problem. And one of the ways that we know that too is if you look at what it costs, for instance, to run for office.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can run for the president of the United States unless you're a rich person or you got a bunch of rich friends anymore at all. I mean, none of our founders, some of our founders were pretty well off. George Washington wasn't, a poor guy, but you couldn't run for office today without having seriously rich friends or being rich yourself.
Yeah. Or having people who are very rich have a lot of interest in you being in office.
Right. Exactly. And so they can get the outcomes that they want.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. All right, Dave. I think we covered that.
Yep.
We went way over on time, but I think that was good to kind of lay all that out. Again, when we say tell us where we got it wrong, what we mean is we're talking how we see the values changing in these industries and institutions from how it was to how it is now, and this conflict that's resulting. If you think we're describing that wrong, if you think, hey, no, Hollywood's doing this and thing different than what you said, or they're not doing the thing you said, we'd love to hear that.
Yep.
That's the kind of stuff we're talking about. We want Kenny G to have a full picture of what we're going through, not just me and Dave's perspective, but tell us what you're seeing, what you're experiencing, what you think we got wrong specifically about the things we're talking about. That's it for this time. I think we covered those pretty well. So until next time, this is Dave and Brian signing off.
See you next week.
Do you want to be Unsilent? Make your voice heard on our social media channels and share where you think we got it right or wrong. Go to unsilentpodcast.com for social links so you can join the discussion.